And we are live. My name is Paulo Javier. I'm a poet and the program director of Poets House. Welcome to Poets House live streaming from the great ether/internet. Poets House is a 30-plus-year-old literary nonprofit situated on Manhattan in Lenape Haking, or Ehenda Wakitit, the traditional and ancestral land of the Canarsie, Kapsi, Huerpos, Siwanoy, and Wekwaskik, collectively known today as the Ramapo, Nanticoke, Lenni Lenape, and Delaware Lenape. I offer my respect to Lenape people and to their continuing presence in their homeland and throughout the diaspora. I offer my reverence. I'm so excited to be introducing tonight's program. It actually continues a series of programs that we began, including in our events that are focused on celebrating and really mining occult poetic tradition, occult poetic history. This program tonight really continues this new way of really embracing poetics and looking at an alternative history of poetry, even within the Western tradition. But I personally actually encountered Amy's work at a conference celebrating Strange Attractor, which is the press that we publishing Amy's biography on Ithell Colquhoun. And it was in this talk where I was reintroduced to Ithell. I knew of Ithell as a painter, but I didn't know much of Ithell as an all-around artist, writer, philosopher, novelist. And Amy's talk was incredibly inspiring. And I immediately got back to work and made sure that this season we invited Amy to our series, and here we are. Without further ado, please let me introduce Dr. Amy Hale, who is an anthropologist and folklorist, PhD folklore UCLA, specializing in modern Cornwall and contemporary esoteric history and culture. Hale has co-edited 4 books and has written over 30 chapters and articles, ranging in topic from modern Druidry to Cornish ethno-nationalism, pagan religious tourism, and occult performance art. Recognized as a lively speaker and essayist, her biography of surrealist and occultist Ithell Colquhoun, genius of the Fern-loved Gully, amazing title, is forthcoming from Strange Attractor Press sometime in the next few months, hopefully, fingers crossed. So without further ado, I am so thrilled to be welcoming Amy Hale to our broadcast.
Hi. I want to say hi, Paulo, and hi, Reggie, and hello to Tim, who is out there in the ethers and with us in spirit. I am absolutely delighted and honored that you would have me to come and speak and to share some words about Ithell Colquhoun, who I have been working on now for about 20 years in one way or another, and she is constantly revealing herself to me every day. I think she was a remarkably complex figure, and I think that she was also one of the most exciting and creative occult thinkers of the 20th century. And so I am super excited to be able to share her with you today. People have said recently, with some of the works that have come out and some recent rediscovery of female surrealists, that Ithell Colquhoun is having a moment. But I actually think that Ithell Colquhoun hasn't even started having her moment yet. So I'm really excited about what the next few years are going to bring in terms of discovering and rediscovering her work and what is going to be a legacy that I think we've just started to untap. So what I'm going to do today, how we're going to start today, if this is a good idea, is I'm going to give just a little bit of a background and a little bit of context about her life. Most people know her as so far as either an occultist or as a surrealist, visual artist. They might know a little bit about her psychogeographic works, but I think that Ithell probably would have wanted to be seen as a whole package, as she was a visual artist. She was a poet. She was a novelist. She was she wrote biographical works. She was an essayist. So she really ran the whole gamut. But today what I'm going to try to do is just give you a little bit of background so that we can kind of look at the context of her life and work. But I want to focus specifically on her automatism and the way in which her artistic process reflected this incredibly complex occult worldview, where she perceived the universe as having so many dimensions and layers that she could contact through her work and to bring to the viewer and to her audience through whatever form of work she was doing at the time. So I want to start out by giving you a few biographical details. Ithell Colquhoun was born in 1906 in India. She was born into a colonialist family, and her roots in India, her family roots, actually went back a number of generations on both sides. And she was a very liminal figure in so many ways. She really felt when she returned to England, well, she didn't return to England because she'd never been to England, but she went to England with her family before she was 1. And she always kind of felt robbed of a native identity in India that she felt was actually part of her own heritage. And it was, I think, a real challenge for her to find identity because she felt very spiritually connected to the landscape in which she was born. So when she went to England with her family, when her mother returned with her at the age of 1, there was this kind of dislocation that I think lasted for a lot of her life, which is one of the reasons that she became so interested and involved in pursuing her own Celtic identity, which I think was part of what inspired her relationship with Cornwall later on in her life. But she always, I think, kind of felt that although she had this relationship with England and with Britain, that it was never necessarily a very comfortable one. So she was born into colonialism. She had a very unusual upbringing. Her parents weren't around very much. Her mom traveled back and forth to India to be with her father. So she went and stayed with a number of family members. She didn't have a really formal education until she was I don't think she learned to read until she was about 8. She didn't start going to school until she was about 11. Her mother really kind of wanted her to run free and experience her senses in a very kind of primal way. She didn't want to have her be too fettered or too socially constructed by formal education when she was much younger. But she was also, I think it's important to remember that even though Ithell was drawn to that which was wild, that she also she had a certain amount of privilege in her life. So she never really had, except for a few brief periods, a full-time job, or she didn't really seek employment. She was dedicated to art. She was dedicated to being an artist first and foremost, and anything else would have intruded on that, which is one of the reasons that she had such a voluminous output throughout her life, which was absolutely remarkable. Her paintings, her writings, really quite staggering in terms of her output. So she was formally trained in the arts. She went to Cheltenham School of Arts and Crafts when she was a young woman, and then went to the Slade School of Art to get an art degree from 1928 to 1930. And it was while she was at the Slade in London that she was able to really start being involved in occult community. She met with her cousin, this kind of remote cousin, Edward Garston, who was really big into alchemy and was a member of the Golden Dawn. And she joined the Quest Society when she was quite young at the Slade, and began finding occult community very much at the same time that she was involved in her very formal art education. She also started discovering the works of Aleister Crowley, and I think that she was very ambivalent about Crowley throughout her life and her encounters with the occult. But love him or hate him, you can't ignore him, right? So She found out about him and his world while she was still quite young. And still about that time, she started finding the works of Yeats, W.B. Yeats. And I think it's my opinion that Yeats was really the biggest and most profound influence on her work, lifelong, whether it was her interest in the Celts or whether it was her interest in the Golden Dawn or magic and alchemy. I really think that in many ways she patterned herself after Yeats and shared many of what she would have perceived as his values. When she was finished at the Slate in 1930, she went to kind of hang out in Europe for a while. She went to Paris for a bit and spent some time in the Mediterranean, where she, I think not insignificantly, had an affair with a woman. She certainly, whether she probably would never have saw herself or identified as bisexual, but I think that especially as we look through her work and through the sexuality of her work, I don't think that we can discount the importance of the queer perspective in looking at the corpus of her work overall. Then when she came back, by 1936, she had discovered surrealism. And I wanted to say that although people tend to see her, or have historically seen Ithell Colquhoun as a surrealist artist, that her surrealism and everything else she did was in service to her occult passions, her love of the occult and her need for enlightenment was absolutely the driving force in her life. And so she discovered surrealism at the London Surrealist Exhibition in 1936. And so much of what they were doing resonated with her, not just as an occultist. She had an incredible body of work already by 1936. But this resonated with her as an occultist, as somebody who was interested in the liminal and in other spaces and in other dimensions. And so she became affiliated with the surrealist movement. Now, the first image of her work that I want us to look at is actually the Pine family. Now, this is from 1940, but it really, I think that it shows her early surrealism is very much inspired by, say, you can see Dali in there, you can see some Magritte in there, but it's kind of that dreamlike imagery, and it comes from her, it's a progression from her earlier interest in painting the natural world. In the late 30s and in the mid 30s, she was painting a lot of flowers and a lot of plants and exotic plants, or plants that would have been exotic for London at the time. And her plants became more and more sexual and explicit over time. And then as she finds surrealism, we see her kind of transitioning from that natural world into this very dreamlike imagery that's very mythic. So the Pine family is actually, I think it's more like almost like a representation of the wasteland. It was done during wartime. We see it's a castrated male, a castrated female, and a castrated hermaphrodite. But they are seen here as these logs, as these natural forms. And I think that they are symbolic of the waste that is going around on her in London at the time, and needing for something to rejuvenate the spirit and also the land. So this is some of her earlier surrealism. But by 1939, she starts becoming interested in automatism. She heads back to France and ends up at a surrealist kind of conclave for a couple of weeks with Gordon Onslow Ford and Roberto Matta, who were really exploring visual automatism at the time and looking into the relationship between automatic writing, automatic painting, and other dimensions. And I think that it's really at this point that we see the trajectory of the rest of her life as an automatic painter. And she starts working with automatism in the late 30s, and in 1949, she writes one of the first essays on automatic painting called The Mantic Stain. And she writes about the automatic process as being linked to the elements. So for example, if we want to look here at Gorgon, which was a decalcomania, which she attributed to the element of earth. And she would take paints and then arrange them in a way and then smash another surface down on top of it and then pull it back up again to reveal these incredible textures that she would work in to find detail. So I think that this is Gorgon. So, you know, we've got this kind of incredible female frightening essence and spirit that comes out of this particular piece. Another form that she used, if we can look at Autumnal Equinox from 1949, is a frottage, which is a rubbing. So she used this was done with a door, a big wooden door, and she used rubbing to see, you know, she kind of rubbed the surface with some sort of probably charcoal, and then put paint down over it and worked the female figure out of the rubbing that came off of this incredibly wood-grained door. So she would use these to try to bring out not just things from her subconscious, but also from what she would have perceived as other dimensions and other forms that she might use. She might call to them using the divination of an earth element or a rubbing to see what would come out. I also wanted to show you this lovely piece, Horus, which was kind of unusual. This is from maybe 1957, probably the late 50s. And this is a stilomancy, where she would take colors and paint on one half, and then she would fold the paper over, and then she would have this very symmetrical image that, again, you can see here where she worked in details to bring out the form of the god Horus. And I think that the automatic processes of her work, the way that she was conceptualizing them, was that she was taking on the role of artist as seer and artist as perhaps sorceress, because she had the ability to reach through to other dimensions and other planes and other beings, and then to have that experience and to translate it to her audience and to her viewers. So I wanted to just very, very briefly go through and talk about the second stage of her life. After she leaves the surrealist movement, she actually left the surrealist movement formally in 1940. She got married in 1942 to another surrealist, Tony Del Renzio, and it didn't go very well. They split up in 1947. And after that, she starts going down to Cornwall, and she rents a house there. In 1947, between 1947 and 1949, she rents a house there called Vow Cave, and this becomes her studio. And she goes back and forth between London and Cornwall for 10 years. She resides in Cornwall ultimately full-time from 1959 in the small village of Paul, which is just between Newlyn and Mousehole. And it's during this time that her visual artistic production drops a little bit, but she really starts to explore her magical life and magical community and writing. So it's in the 1950s that we see her produce these very beloved travelogues called Crying of the Wind, which is her experience of the mythic landscape of Ireland, and then The Living Stones, Cornwall, which I call her love letter to Cornwall and the sacred landscape, and just kind of lovely weirdness that many people see in Cornwall. And that was from 1957. And so she's really exploring her more writerly, more poetic self during the 50s and the 60s. And we see in those pieces, we really see her animism. She considers herself to be an animist first and foremost. And we really see in these writings and in a lot of her poetry, her animism comes through as she experiences life and the landscape as very much alive and sentient, and something that you can communicate with if you get into the right headspace. And so I want to finish up by the end of her life. And she was a very, very vibrant artist, and she continued working up until a few years before her death. And some of her most amazing pieces came in her 70s. And in 1977, she produces an incredible automatic work, looking again at the principles that she was using before earlier in the 1940s. She creates these sets of magical enamels that I think are some of the finest of the automatic pieces that she created. And the first thing that I want to look at is her tarot deck from 1977. I think we've got a couple of images there. And these were small enamels. She did a complete deck of 78 cards in 1977. They were based on the Golden Dawn system of cards, which predated the Rider-Waite-Smith pack by probably about 20 years. The tarot cards used by the Golden Dawn, they were actually just descriptions. They were given to members for their own personal use. And she drew on those and color symbolism to create what I think is probably the very first abstract deck ever. And they're absolutely incredible, but they weren't designed for reading, because at this stage in her life, she thought that doing any divination with them would have been a corruption of the use of the cards. So she thought that they were really more suited for meditation, and so that you could actually get to know the cards more deeply if you surrendered yourself to them. And they are absolutely fantastic for that kind of journey. And then I think a companion piece that she did in 1978 and 1979 was the Decad of Intelligence. And the Decad of Intelligence, they have some very structural similarities. They're also enamel pieces. And they are her in-depth studies of the Sephiroth of the Tree of Life. And if you look at them, you'll notice that this is Chokmah. This is the second of the Sephira on the tree. And if you look at these, you'll notice that they are slightly vulvic, perhaps slightly suggestive of a vulva. And I think that is partially because they are seen as vessels. The Sephiroth are understood as being feminine in character because they are vessels through which the energy of the Tree of Life flows. And I believe that she was trying to communicate something about this, perhaps in this particular set of works. And so I really feel that even at the end of her life, she was still exploring this way of using art and connection with the numinous to figure out a way to communicate something about other dimensions and other spaces through her art, and perhaps to a very limited audience. But I think what was most important was that she had the experience, and that she was able to work with this material in such a profound way, if nothing else, for her own edification, and as an incredible example of how it was that she must have seen the world. And this is always the question that I come back to with Ithell Colquhoun's work, was somebody who was so invested in color and in form and in symbol. What did her world look like when suddenly every shade of green or every shade of red stood for something else? Every shape, every color was a gateway or a doorway into another expanse of the universe and another dimension, and was pregnant with other beings. And I think that that is really the journey of a lifelong esotericist and a lifelong occultist, is cultivating that type of vision and that type of embodied experience. And with her art and with her work, she gets to share a little bit of that with us.
Thank you so much, Amy. Please allow me at this point to introduce Timothy Liu. Timothy Liu's latest book of poems is Let It Ride, which was published in 2019 by Saturnalia Books. His poems have been translated into a dozen languages, and his journals and papers are archived in the Berg collection at the New York Public Library. You can find out more about Tim's work and his praxis on timothyliu.net. Tim actually offered a workshop on tarot and poetry with the poet Hua Nguyen a couple of years ago. And I just really couldn't think of a more engaged practitioner of the tarot and visual art than Tim. And so I'm really thrilled that Tim is able to be a part of this program.
Hello, Poets House, Paulo Javier, Amy Hale. Happy to be here today as we talk about the wondrous Ithell Colquhoun, Renaissance woman, poet, painter, occultist. So many things to learn by her example. Today, I'm going to reach out and have her talk to us through the tarot. This is the Tarot of Delphi, created and curated by J.D. Hildegard Hinkle. This contemporary deck is long out of print. On eBay, you could probably get one if they're available at all for $300 to $500. But I adore this deck. It really goes straight to the oracle, and especially if we want to contact those who have crossed over, I find this deck is just superb. And I'm reminded of a workshop on poetry and the tarot that Hua Nguyen and I taught at Poets House a few years ago. And so in that tradition, I would like to invoke the spirits and call upon Ithell Colquhoun to lead us through 3 of her books. When I was shuffling the deck earlier this morning, this card popped out. This is the 9 of Cups. Normally this is a cup of satisfaction, both emotionally, spiritually, a little bit of a pat on one's own back. In this deck, I feel like Ithell is reaching out today, and this is how she feels about the proceedings. Yeah, let's go ahead and do it. All right. The first book I'm going to look at is this wonderful memoir, travelogue she wrote called The Crying of the Wind, Ireland. This is one of my favorite books of hers. I was actually in Dublin and Belfast about 15 months ago, back in during the holidays at the end of 2018, back at a time when we could travel. And of course, isn't that wonderful to think about being able to travel again? Anyways, she wrote a book on her travels through Ireland. Less a Baedeker than really a poet, occultist mind encountering landscapes that are completely charged with all that has gone on before it. And the sentences are really a marvel. She also wrote a book about Cornwall, which I look forward to reading next. So I'm going to pull a card here, adjust my camera, pull a card here to see what page she wants us to read from this morning. And so what do we have here? Oh, lovely. We have the Garden. This is the 21st card of the Major Arcana. Many of us know this card as the World, but today we have the Garden, and we have three beautiful women sleeping here. And my cat Smoke has just jumped on the table. And let's read a little bit from page 21 of Ithell Colquhoun's travels. And today we're going to hear a little bit about the Liffey Valley. A bumpy avenue seemed to lead through parkland. A favorite Irish technique in road repair is to fill the potholes with pebbles and leave the traffic to level them. Then there was the stone-flagged hall of a Georgian house and a clamor of voices. Someone suggested a bath and sleep for me, and I gladly acquiesced. A long, narrow bedroom housed a bath and lavatory, and ancient family photographs by Eliot and Fry, the figures posed as conversation pieces, shared the walls with John Leech's sporting prints. There must have been a vogue once for the latter as bathroom decor, for I remember them at my grandparents' house. The water was surprisingly hot. My room was large and dim. It was uncarpeted and not very quiet, since it backed onto the plumbing of the bathroom. But I slept at first from sheer exhaustion. Isn't that lovely to be able to accompany our tour guide through all these landscapes? And, you know, I love that little detail about, where do we go? About this Irish technique in road repair is to fill the potholes with pebbles and leave the traffic to level them. Okay, I know what we're really here for. We all want some magic, don't we? I'm going to now see what Ithell wants us to hear from this collection of her magical writings. You know, this is what we have right now. I really look forward to the edition of, or the anthology of writings that Amy is putting together. This was assembled by Steve Nichols. To give you an example, Ithell wrote about the first, I'm going to say the first, 17 cards of the major arcana in the tarot, but she never finished it, and so our kind editor here finished writing about the remaining cards that Ithell didn't get to. And you can really see a difference in the writing. Now, I would not study the tarot using this book because basically what Ithell did is she wrote down a lot of notes, thoughts that she had about these cards. And, you know, all of us who study the cards keep our own notebooks where we jot down impressions and, you know, things that we've learned from the deck. You know, it's the cards that actually teach us. And I don't think she really intended for these notes to be read in any kind of systematic way. And in fact, if you read the section in this book on the tarot, you'll find things to be quite a mess. And which makes it fun. I think sometimes there's nothing more fun than slogging through a mess of wonderful ideas. All right, let's see what she wants us to read from her magical writings today. My goodness, we have the Ace of Wands today, and this would be a gift of fire. I'm thinking a little bit about Prometheus. So let's see. What would be... Here's the... Let's see, I have to do the math here. So we have to go 14, 28, 29, plus 21, plus 0. So not only does the tree extend itself down the plains, but it also condenses itself, since each sephira contains within itself its own tree. Thus, the Kether of Tifereth is the highest point or crown of the central emanation. Conversely, the triumph of Kether is the central point or harmony of the highest emanation. Therefore, the complete symbol comprises not 40 but 400 Sephiroth. This property of the glyph for extension and condensation shows its aptness for symbolizing the two abysses, of the infinitely minute on the one hand, and of the infinitely huge on the other, between which our limited spatial life is passed. And here's a little image from Kabbalah of the Sephiroth. Are we having fun yet? I hope so. What else are we going to do in lockdown? You know, it's amazing to me, folks on social media who say they're bored as fuck. I mean, where are your inner resources? Man, woman, thing. There's a tradition in tarot that your first deck has to be either gifted to you by someone else, or you have to steal it. I think that's really something to reflect upon. Your first tarot deck either has to be gifted to you, or you have to go out and steal it. Everything else that we have in our kit, all the hocus pocus, the apparatus on our tables, so much of it really has to be given to us. And today, this amazing crystal came to me from a mentor, Savaranda, that I give readings with here in Woodstock at the Mirabai Bookshop. But anyways, this is truly an amazing piece from his collection. And, you know, Sarv, he's in his 70s now, and he kindly just let me walk through his house the other day and let me just fill up on crystals he's collected over his lifetime. So we're going to end today by looking at this book a little bit. This is The Sword of Wisdom, a book that Ithell wrote about one of her great mentors, McGregor Mathers, who was there at the beginning with the organization of the Golden Dawn. And, this is even before Pamela Coleman Smith made her deck with Arthur Waite, the Rider Tarot that is the most famous deck of the 20th century. Incidentally, Ithell created her own tarot deck, and unfortunately, when the design was remade, it was in such a limited quantity that I have not been able to get a hold of one, or I'd be reading today using her deck. So, Ithell Colquhoun, what should we read from Matthew McGregor? And today we get the third card of the major arcana, the Empress. And this, of course, is the Great Mother. This is Demeter. So we're going to read from just the third chapter of this book. Here's an image of Moenia McGregor Mathers. What a wonderful portrait. Who are the secret chiefs? Certain members of the AO claim to be in touch with them, as I have described. For instance, they were said to make known their wishes through Mrs. Wire, Imperator of the order. Her authority was derived in direct line from Mathers, her immediate predecessor in office and connecting link being his widow, Moenia. Meredith Starr did not speak of the chiefs as far as I heard, but he had been a disciple of Crowley, who was always talking about them, claiming, among much else, that they had inspired him since 1904, when one of them dictated to him the script of Liber al Vel Legis, or the Book of the Law. The Society of the Inner Light did not call them secret chiefs, preferring the theosophical term masters. The correspondence course made frequent allusion to them under this name, and students following it were enjoined to make a salutation to them every day at noon. Another dissident offshoot of the GD, the Order of the Stella Matutina, or Morning Star, stated at one period of its history that it had made a contact with some sun masters. Personally, I distrust any such beings unless balanced by moon mistresses, and I say this without flippant intent. You know, when I woke up this morning, I didn't know I would be sharing any of those passages with you. And that to me is how exciting life is. Just foolishly stumbling into the unknown and accepting what comes our way. Let me close today with a thank you again to Poets House for arranging this meeting of spirits and minds. And I'm going to pull a final card. This is what Ithell wants to say to us in conclusion as a blessing. And today we get the Eight of Wands. The traditional meaning of this card is just we're in the middle of everything. Everything's in motion, and let's just follow things to their proper conclusion.
Welcoming back Reggie, my colleague, Reggie Harris, and of course, Amy Hale, who is the biographer of Ithell Colquhoun's story. One thing I think maybe where we could proceed from Amy, your thoughts on Tim's presentation, taking a close look at the tarot and the fixture of tarot praxis in Ithell's work, life, thought, certainly the series of paintings that were recently celebrated in Folger's publication, which you wrote the foreword to.
Sure. First, I thought that Tim's presentation was really beautiful and really thoughtful. I think that deck is gorgeous. I think Ithell would have really loved that approach. I think she would have really liked that deck. And there are obviously, picking up on the theme of the seer, and not just Ithell as the seer, but we have Tim also as the kind of providing this connection through this deck, which is a Delphic deck. And I thought that there were so many really cool connections there that I really enjoyed. And there was something else that I had wanted to mention about Tim's presentation. There is a friend of mine who is another Ithell aficionado, Steve Patterson, who is Cornish, and he's done some art projects. He's led some community art projects based on Ithell's work and her automatic techniques and her love of landscape. He did one based in Cornwall and another based in Ireland. And he talked about something called the Hand of Isil. And in fact, he did an altar, which will be in the book. I've got a photo of it, of a bunch of hands and Ithell Colquhoun's face in the middle of it. It's really great. And he talks about this idea of the Hand of Isil and what happens when she comes into your life and she kind of moves everything around. And there was something about Tim's approach. Yeah, Tim could have gone in a whole bunch of directions in doing that, but the approach that he took was personal. It was oracular. It was something that connected with the numinous in a way that I think she would have really loved. And when I saw the presentation, my first thought was, oh, Tim's been touched with the Hand of Isil too. So good luck, Tim, because now you've got the Hand of Isil on you. And it is a beautiful condition, but one that you don't escape from very easily. So you have that to look forward to. In terms of the tarot, what I think is fascinating, so the book that Tim was referring to that had some essays that Ithell wrote about the tarot in it, Ithell had a number of different essays that she did about the tarot, some of which were published, some of which were not, some of which were private letters and correspondence that she did, where she was really getting into the traditional imagery of the tarot and looking at it and dissecting it and making some connections between different forms with the tarot and masonry and tantra and things like that. So she did a lot with looking at very traditional imagery, but what's really fascinating is that we see this progression in her work of looking at the imagery and exploring imagery of tarot and making that really intellectual connection that I think tarot symbolism often asks people to make, especially when they first start reading, where you're trying to figure out, oh, what does everything mean and how does everything fit together and how do I tell a story with this? And moving from that kind of readership and that kind of experience with the tarot to something which is not just remarkably abstract, but that forces a direct engagement with what she considered to be the powers and the forces behind each of those tarot cards. So, by the time she's reached the end of her life, we're not reading tarot anymore. We're not doing divination. We don't need to be doing that. You need to be talking to the tarot cards, or more rightfully, you need to let the tarot cards talk to you. And I think that's the progression that we ended up seeing. Even though we would describe her deck as abstract, I don't think that's how she would have perceived that project. She would have seen it maybe not directly representational, but certainly as characterizing forces that were very precise. She was representing something very precise because those tarot cards weren't necessarily for telling stories or telling stories to other people. They were doorways for having a direct experience.
What I wanted to ask, Amy, I mean, the tarot is really fascinating in terms of its connection to poetic practice. I know certainly for Ithell, but also for better known modernists such as Yeats, you can't overlook the role that the tarot plays in The Wasteland, T.S. Eliot's great poem. It's in that poem itself. Now, to what extent Eliot actually used his deck to generate that poem, I'm not familiar with, to use an occult term, being familiar. But, what is it about the tarot you think that for this particular generation of poets, and I also want to transition to Ithell as a poet shortly, Austin Osman Spare made his own deck, and maybe you could speak to, what is it about the tarot? For me, immediately, it's its symbolism. The size of it, the deck of it, its nature is immediately appealing as a poet, because it can be held as a text, but it's obviously not a text that is linear or intended to be read in that way, although you do read the cards. But to your mind and in your own research, really captivated Ithell. And I mean, the surrealists really were into the tarot as well.
I think you're right. I think that it's not just necessarily the fact that you've got this really rich symbolism, but it is as much that as the process of the tarot and where particular artists might have believed that those symbols, what they come from, where they came from, and what they could potentially generate. So if you think about these as I'm sure a number of the surrealists did, as being archetypal, as being symbols that were in some way captivated the human connection with the unseen, with the eternal, with that which would have been considered the perennial. You know, that there was this incredible storehouse of images that you could use to make contact with either your subconscious, which was perhaps how many of the surrealists would have seen it, or with other planes entirely, which is certainly how Ithell and others might have seen it. So it's about the way in which the tarot can help foster a dialogue between your conscious and something else, and then being able to use that to tell a story which is perhaps or hopefully meaningful, either for yourself or for your querent. And I think it's in that world of possibility that that people get really inspired by the potential of the tarot to help tell stories that might come from somewhere else and might be a little bit more weighty in terms of their significance for people.
Yeah, Amy, I wonder if we could talk a little bit about Ithell's poetry and how it relates to her visual work. Is it, or the rest of her work, not just her visual work, but the travel out, but the travel works and all of her esoterica. Is it? It's not separate from the rest of her work, is it? It's all sort of interconnected and all related to each other. Is that right?
I think that's a great question. I think the way that I would describe it is that she had a really remarkably consistent worldview. And if you're just looking at her poetry and even her art and the other things she did, if you don't know the things that connect it, it might look kind of scattershot. But everything she did, I think, reflects the way in which she saw the world and the universe working. So some of her poetry might seem like it's radically disconnected. So in the 1960s, for example, she did some pieces that were actually reflecting a story that happened that was more relevant to Breton nationalism and an episode that happened among Breton activists. So, you know, she wrote poems about that. She wrote poems about the Celtic experience and about she didn't write that much about Celtic mythology, but it pops up here and there. She also had things that were Celtic based, but done through automatic methods. So it looks like it's kind of all over the place, but in fact, it really isn't. I think that all of her work is exceptionally and remarkably coherent. Now, there are some places, like we saw with the Decad of Intelligence in the first part of the program, where she had, I think, a small body of writing for each one piece for each sephira, and then she had the kind of the meditative picture that she did, that I think that they were supposed to go together, which is why Folger published them as a single unit, so that you could look at these kind of poetic pieces which give you the information that you need to know about each sephira, and then you look at the image, and I think they're supposed to be paired together. She also, very early on in the 1940s, did a series of paintings which were very alchemical in nature, called Diagrams of Love. They were alchemical and very sexual, sometimes explicitly, sometimes you can't see that in there, but I'd be happy to point it out for you. And she had some poems that were alchemical in nature called, that were the Diagrams of Love poetic series. So occasionally she did do some things where she would have poetic sequences that were illustrated. But of course, all of her writings, and they weren't poetic, but the Crying of the Wind, Ireland, and Livingstone's Cornwall were also illustrated, and she did the illustrations for those as well. She did have some poetry sequences that were published. They were written much earlier in her life, but published much later in her life. Osmazone and Grimoire of the Entangled Thicket. Grimoire of the Entangled Thicket is a kind of a Celtic-based small collection of pieces. They reflect on the idea of the Celtic tree oracle, Celtic tree alphabet, very influenced by Robert Graves' White Goddess. And there was a visual sequence that was supposed to be completed. This is 1971, 1972, that was supposed to go with those, that was never completed, although there are some illustrations for them. And then Osmazone was another collection that she also illustrated. So I think that while there's not always a one-to-one mapping between the imagery in her work and her poems, that they do fit together in kind of the grand Ithell scheme of things.
And just a note for viewers, Amy will actually be giving a reading from Ithell's poetry. But I wanted to return us to Ithell's childhood in India. And was there a reckoning with their colonialist upbringing, but also a kind of drawing from the fact that she and her family were living in a really rich nation country space of occult tradition and esoteric wisdom? I'm always thinking about, when I proceed with my own inquiry into Western occult praxis, is how informed it is by Eastern thought. I wanted to ask you, as a biographer of Ithell, if for someone who felt so out of place, unable to locate their identity growing up in India, if in her interest later in life in occult praxis, she found something in Indian occult tradition or Indian spirituality that connects to her adult interest in the occult?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's also very timely because the academic field of what has been known as Western esotericism is now having a really robust and very important internal conversation about what that Western means. And many of us think that in terms of an academic discipline that, yeah, it's time that we drop that, because there are a whole bunch of colonialist resonances to that term when we relate it to esotericism in the West that are really, we don't want to be reproducing those, and it's important to really important to have the conversation about that. So I'm glad that that's happening. In terms of Ithell's own spirituality, she was definitely a perennialist, and in my view, perennialism has a lot of problems, but she thought that many of the systems, the religious and spiritual systems of the world, were all connected back to a greater truth that had very localized expressions. But she was very drawn to Tantra, and Tantra in not just the, what people consider to be the sexy part. She was actually drawn to ideas of finding the sacred in that which is earthly. She started dealing with ideas of taboo and blasphemy very, very early on in her spirituality. And I think that a lot of that was connected to what she knew about tantric traditions, where you have spiritual work that is done with what we would consider to be taboo. Also, she was born in northern India, and so I think she felt that an exploration of Tantra, much of which at the time she would have gotten through the books of Arthur Avalon or John Woodruff, would have been particularly appropriate for her, because that's the area where she was born. But at the end of the day, she really struggled with what she felt. She really felt like she should be doing some sort of Indian spirituality. and she felt like that was taken from her as a path. And so the way that she interpreted the way that that played out in her own life was because she identified as an animist. And she wrote that in her view that the people of northern India were animist before anything else, and that her animism was an expression of where she felt she came from. But I don't think that she was able, she loved India, and she felt like that was taken from her. The degree to which she was able to reckon with her family's colonial past, that was probably, she probably didn't have the best framework for doing that.
Great. I mean, actually, you bring up a point I wanted to make when you talk about her animism. I'm interested in that as a Filipinx Filipino, and it's definitely in pre-colonial history animism, where I'm from. But it also connects to my question about Ithell's occult praxis as, as a political project as well, because you are then engaged when you're thinking about Celtic mythology. You mentioned Robert Graves' The White Goddess. I mean, we're talking about pre-Christian traditions. I watched Ari Aster's film Midsummer. I don't know if you saw that. It's like a really interesting film in terms of the viewer. If you are pagan, right? If you are Christian or you come from whichever tradition, then what will be unfolding will be disturbing to you. I also see it as a political film in the same way that I sense in Ithell's return to Cornwall, being a part of a community of thinkers, of magicians and practitioners who are really resisting bubbling themselves off from, right, the Judeo-Christian oppression.
That you're getting into a whole mare's nest of really challenging aspects around nativism and pagan spiritualities and esoteric spiritualities in Britain, and the relationship between how that nativism plays out, particularly in like 20th century British occult culture, and its relationship to Celtic spirituality, but also Celtic identities. Now, Ithell loved Cornwall, but she was not Cornish. She was not ethnically Cornish. And historically, the Celtic nationalists or Celtic activists or people who do affiliate with a Celtic identity, certainly during that period, would not, many of them would not have identified with any kind of esoteric spirituality at all. Irish nationalists were mostly, not entirely, but the ones who really got the most profile were Catholic. Many Welsh activists identify, as do Cornish activists, with Methodism. And so there has been a tradition of people who claim a Celtic spiritual identity, even though they are English, based on the idea that the earliest indigenous that we know of substrata of Britain was Celtic rather than Saxon. And so to say that people don't have an ancestral connection to any kind of Celticity in Britain, well, that's not correct, because sure, it was originally, or at least very early on, it was groups of Celtic peoples. But in terms of contemporary Celtic ethnicities and the way that they have asserted themselves politically, there is a distinction between those two groups, and they haven't always seen eye to eye. So Ithell was very aware of the fact that even though she supported Celtic nationalisms, and she did see the English as invading Celtic spaces, she kind of also, I think, was very respectful of her own boundaries, and she did not claim Cornish identity. She did not claim to be ethnically Cornish. She was, I think, even though sometimes I didn't really agree with a lot of her politics, because she was probably way too right-wing for me, I think that she was in many ways at the time a fairly sensitive ally to the Cornish. And I think that she did a good job of trying to promote the Cornish culture in a way that was thoughtful and sensitive for the time. I think that she did a good job there, and because she didn't claim to be something that she wasn't. Not that I ever saw.
Right. I mean, we can keep going on, but we are, short on time. I wanted to make sure that we made time to talk about your biography and your connection to Ithell. How maybe you could tell us a little bit more about how your biography started, and tell us a little bit more about, where has this biography taken you and what's next?
It's, I was touched by the Hand of Isil about 20 years ago. I was kind of grabbed by it. And when I started working with her material in the Tate, when I was living in Cornwall and teaching in Cornwall, I was working for the Institute of Cornish Studies, which is a department of the University of Exeter. And I was a lecturer there. And I was told that I really needed to look into her work. And so I did. And I went up to the Tate to start exploring, and it was not even cataloged. It was just 26 boxes that somebody wheeled out on a pallet for me to have a look at. And the correspondence and the art and the sketches were so phenomenal. I knew there was no going back. And over time, as I've had more access to her work, it's been challenging. The National Trust had 5,000 pieces of her work that were only this last year given to the Tate. Myself and only a few others have ever been privileged enough to see the entirety of that collection, and it's absolutely staggering. So as time has gone on, it has been easier to work with the material. But in terms of building, I'm an anthropologist, and most of the writing that I've done is academic writing. When I do other essays, I'm generally arguing a point. And so this was an exercise in not just storytelling for me, but in helping to translate the relationship that I have with her, because I do have a relationship with her. And I understand in life that she had a tendency to be a bit cranky, and she's cranky from beyond the grave as well. It's not always been easy in trying to and being so devoted to telling her story. It hasn't always been it hasn't always been smooth sailing. And here we are, and we're right at the end of the road, and now we've got a pandemic. I'm like, oh, really? So it's been an incredible journey. She tells me more about herself every day. Every day I see something and I'm reading something else into it. I've read her work and her poems and her books so many times, and they're different every time. It's like looking at her art. It just goes so deep. So even though there are times when I say, okay, I'm done with this, I need to move on, I can't move on. I'm not moving on. I have other projects that I'm working on, but I will always be coming back to Ithell. So the book is coming out with Strange Attractor. I'm pretty excited by it. It is an unconventional biography. It's not necessarily linear. It's really more thematic. I'm looking at the way that different themes in her life and her identity weave together. So that should be out hopefully late summer, early fall, when things kind of open up again. I'm also working on an edited collection of some of her magical essays, which, as you might have gathered from Tim's presentation, they can be a little bit thick. So I'm hoping to guide the reader through some of those a little bit more. And yeah, those are what I'm working on right now.
That's wonderful.
Okay, well, yeah, I think, just to quote what you said earlier, Amy, we are really just beginning to see and hear and understand Ithell. And I think one thing that always fascinates me about biographers is, how do you know that when you're done? with writing your subject's story, right? But I think you answered that too, that you think you're done, but you're not done. And you actually aren't, because you're editing another book, and that'll be part of, right, an expanded biography
Yeah.
maybe down the road. Who knows, right, when an archive opens. But Reggie, did you want to say something else?
No, I just wanted to thank Amy. This has been a fascinating experience here for me, for someone who did not know Ithell before this conversation. Now I'm very, very interested, and I'm looking forward to reading your biography.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Reggie. It's been a pleasure meeting you and Paolo, and this has been really wonderful today.
Yeah, thank you, Amy Hale, everybody. Please be on the lookout for her biography of Ithell Colquhoun, coming from Strange Attractor sometime either in the summer or the fall. And at Poets House, we'll be sure to include it in our e-blasts and let our viewers and our patrons know. Thank you so much. Amy Hale, who is hailing right now from Atlanta, Georgia. Be safe over there, Amy.
Yep. Thanks, both of you. Be safe as well, and goodbye, and thank you to Tim as well for such an inspiring presentation. So stay safe out there. Stay home. Enjoy yourselves.